More than 180 escape attempts, they came from a penal station covering only 8 hectares, about 20 acres, in Macquarie Harbour. The water was a wall. The wilderness beyond it was another. Neither stopped men from trying. Alexander Pearce was among them. He crossed the water and returned with a story the authorities did not believe. The men in his party had killed and eaten each other as food disappeared. That became Sarah Island's legend. It can also hide the better question. What kind of prison makes the country outside the gate part of the punishment and still produces escape after escape? This is the story of a prison designed to make running irrational. This is the story of Sarah Island. This is Sarah Island. The cannibalism came later. The prison had been designed before any of those men arrived. Sarah Island sat in the southern part of Macquarie Harbour on the west coast of Van Diemen's Land. The island itself was small enough to walk across without much effort. That was not the point. The point was what surrounded it. On paper, a prison needs walls, gates, locks, and enough guards to make the mathematics work. In practice, Macquarie Harbour offered something cheaper. Water separated the island from the shore. Beyond that shore lay country that was difficult to cross, difficult to supply, and difficult to disappear into without eventually needing food. A man could get off the island and still be nowhere near freedom. And that was the point. The government chose Sarah Island as the headquarters of a new penal settlement at the beginning of 1822. The official phrase attached to the choice was banishment and security. It was unusually accurate. This was not simply a distant place where convicts could be stored. It was meant to be a punishment within the larger punishment of transportation, a place for men who had already arrived in Van Diemen's Land and then offended again. Alexander Pearce would become one of them. Not yet. The first problem was more basic. Before the island could punish anyone, it had to function. John Cuthbertson was given the job. His appointments as commandant, magistrate, and justice of the peace were confirmed in December 1821. 4 days later, he left Hobart with the people expected to turn an 8-hectare island into a working settlement. It was not a small party. There were 66 male convicts, 8 female convicts, and 16 soldiers, along with some of the soldiers' wives and children. That last detail matters. A penal station was not only a line of cells facing a yard, it was also a small colonial town assembled around confinement. Soldiers, officers, medical staff, families, stores, workshops, boats, food, timber, paperwork, and the men whose sentences supplied the labor. The settlement could not operate beside the prison. It operated through it. Cuthbertson reported the choice of Sarah Island on the 23rd of January. By July, quarters for the commandant and surgeon had been completed, along with barracks, a hospital, and accommodation for the convicts. Wheat and potatoes had been planted. Boat building had begun. 6 months is not long. There was another problem that no amount of discipline could solve. Sarah Island had no meaningful supply of fresh water. It was small, exposed, and during the convict period, much of its native vegetation was cleared. Everything the settlement needed had to be organized around the limits of the place. The island could isolate men very effectively. Keeping those men alive and working was a separate task, which is to say, the same geography that made Sarah Island useful as a prison also made it awkward as a settlement. This is where the story starts to split in two. One version is the one that survived in popular memory. Punishments, escape attempts, Alexander Pearce, and the story of men killing men in the bush. That version is real. It is not the whole place. Then there is the version with timber, ledgers, ironwork, and hulls. Macquarie Harbour had something the colonial government wanted: Huon pine. Convicts were put to work in the timber trade, and Sarah Island developed workshops around that labor. Skilled prisoners could be used as shipwrights, carpenters, blacksmiths, and clerks. Men placed lower in the internal hierarchy were sent to hard labor and the lumberyard gangs. A prison built to keep men from leaving began teaching some of them how to build ships. Keep that in mind. The shipyard would eventually produce more than 100 vessels. For a time, it was the largest shipbuilding yard in the Australian colonies. The island was becoming productive enough that punishment and industry could be spoken about in the same breath. Free is not the word for any of this. Useful is closer. If places like this are why you're here, subscribe. There are many more beyond the mainland. The contradiction arrived early and never really left. The authorities needed isolation because isolation made escape difficult. They also needed skilled labor because skilled labor made the station valuable. So the settlement trained, organized, and depended on men it was designed not to trust. By then, the water around Sarah Island was doing two jobs. It was part of the security system, and it was the road by which timber, supplies, officials, and finished vessels had to move. That distinction will matter later. For now, the important thing is that the prison did not begin with Alexander Pearce. It began with a location, a labor problem, and a government decision that the country outside the settlement could do part of the guarding. The island had been chosen. Now the men had to build the prison that was meant to hold them. The island had been chosen. Now the men had to build the prison that was meant to hold them. Start at the water, because everyone had to. Sarah Island did not have a road into Macquarie Harbour. It had boats, landing places, stores that had to arrive by water, and work that depended on the same water that was supposed to keep prisoners in. A man sent there entered the settlement through the very thing that made it secure. From the landing, the logic of the place spread outward. There were quarters for the commandant and the surgeon. There were barracks, a hospital, convict accommodation, workshops, storage, and the working spaces needed to turn timber into something the colony could use. By July 1822, much of that basic structure had already been put in place. The settlement was only months old. The speed mattered because nothing about Sarah Island could wait for ideal conditions. Men had to be housed. Sick men had to be treated somewhere. Soldiers needed quarters. Food had to be grown where it could be grown. Boats had to be kept serviceable. Timber had to move. Then there was the shipyard. Macquarie Harbour contained Huon pine, a timber valued for shipbuilding because of its durability in wet conditions. The prison had labor. The harbor had timber. The colony had ships it needed built and repaired. Those three facts fitted together too neatly for the administration to ignore. So the punishment station became a workplace. Skilled convicts were assigned as shipwrights, carpenters, blacksmiths, and clerks. Others went into harder labor, including lumberyard work. The difference between those assignments was not freedom. It was the kind of work a man was useful for. That was the rule. Here is what it meant on the island. A carpenter could spend his day doing work that required judgment, measurement, and tools. A blacksmith could be valuable because ironwork had to be made and repaired. A clerk could be valuable because a penal station generated lists, orders, stores, and punishments as reliably as it generated timber. A man without a useful trade could be sent where strength mattered more than skill. The sentence stayed the same. On paper, all of them were convicts under punishment. In practice, the settlement depended on differences between them. The administration needed men it could trust with tools, men it could trust with measurements, and men it could use to keep the whole station working. Trust is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The men were still prisoners. Walk farther into the working part of the island and the contradiction becomes harder to miss. A government had selected Sarah Island because escape was supposed to be irrational. Then it concentrated shipbuilding skill in the same place. The yard would eventually produce more than 100 vessels. That is not a figure of speech. More than 100 hulls meant repeated access to timber, ironwork, fittings, tools, boat knowledge, and the practical habits of moving things across water. On paper, those were work skills. In practice, they were also knowledge of vessels. None of that meant a prisoner could simply take a ship and leave. Not quite. Guards, supervision, the harbor, and the larger geography still mattered. But the knowledge existed. Keep that in mind. By then, the shipyard was changing how Sarah Island should be pictured. Here's the part that matters. It was not a stone box standing alone in empty water. It was a working settlement with noise, tools, timber, boats, stores, officers, soldiers, families, and convicts moving through assigned labor. 20 acres was enough. The machinery around it was much larger. Cuthbertson's first months show how quickly that system had to be assembled. The commandant could not separate punishment from logistics because the same men being punished were also building the place, feeding parts of it, repairing parts of it, and making it economically useful. Here's the part that matters for the story later. Every prison has to decide what a prisoner is allowed to learn. Sarah Island needed skilled labor badly enough that some convicts were used in trades that made the settlement valuable. Shipbuilding was one of them. The colony could not get the benefit of those skills without also putting those skills into the hands of prisoners. That problem was built into the arrangement. It did not make escape easy. It made something else possible. Men could learn exactly how vessels were built, handled, repaired, and prepared for water while living inside a place designed around the idea that water was a barrier. For most of the station's life, that contradiction remained contained. Mostly. Before it mattered, however, the settlement had to establish a daily order. Buildings could be finished faster than habits. The men who filled them had to learn what work meant there, what refusal cost, and what happened when the authorities decided ordinary discipline was not enough. The buildings went up in months. The system inside them would last much longer. The first years turned Sarah Island from a construction site into a routine. A plan can make a prison look complete. Routine is what makes it real. Men had to be assigned, counted, moved to work, watched, punished, returned, and sent out again the next day. The system did not need every day to be dramatic. It needed every day to happen. Work divided men by usefulness. Skilled prisoners remained valuable because the station needed trades. Others did the labor that required fewer tools and more endurance. The lumberyard and the shipyard sat inside the same punishment system, but they did not produce the same day for every man. Discipline was physical. Flogging was used frequently in the early years. By the end of the 1820s, longer periods of solitary confinement, sometimes reaching 4 weeks, had come close to replacing the lash in many cases. The method changed. The purpose did not. Which is to say, punishment at Sarah Island was not one fixed ritual repeated for 11 years. The administration adjusted the method while keeping control over work, movement, and obedience. A man could be punished through pain, confinement, or assignment without the prison needing to become a different institution. It is worth saying plainly what that meant for the men on the ground. A work assignment was not merely a job. It decided where a man spent the day, who watched him, what tools he handled, what physical demands he faced, and what opportunities he had to speak with other prisoners. A punishment did not have to remove him from the system. It could simply place him deeper inside it. Then he went back to work. That is the ordinary morning Sarah Island was built to produce. Not one famous incident, but a sequence repeated until the sentence ended or another punishment began. Then came the counting. The settlement held no more than about 385 male convicts at one time, counting Sarah Island and its associated outstations. It still needed a bureaucracy. Names mattered. So did reputations. A repeat offender arriving from elsewhere in Van Diemen's Land did not arrive as a blank man. He came with a sentence already underway and a history that had followed him across the colony. And Sarah Island existed in part for exactly that category of prisoner. Alexander Pearce fit it. Pearce had been transported from Ireland on a 7-year sentence after being convicted of stealing 6 pairs of shoes. He reached Hobart in 1820. The crime that sent him across the world was theft, not murder. That matters too. Pearce entered the transportation system as a thief. Cannibalism came years later. After further offenses in Van Diemen's Land, he was sent to Macquarie Harbour in 1822 to serve secondary punishment. He arrived inside a system already learning how to use isolation, labor, and discipline together. Pearce did not invent the logic of Sarah Island. He entered it. By then, the settlement had already answered one of the questions raised in the opening of this story. Why put a prison here? Because the harbor in the western country could do work that walls usually did. Why build industry there? Because timber and convict labor could be turned into vessels the colony needed. The unanswered question was harder. What happens when a man decides the country outside is still preferable to the system inside? Not quite everyone made that calculation. Most prisoners served, worked, were punished, and remained where the government had put them. But enough men tried to leave that escape became part of Sarah Island's identity. Pearce would become the best-known example. He was not the only one. That distinction matters because the next part can easily be told as if a single abnormal man wandered into an otherwise functioning institution. The numbers do not support that version. More than 180 escape attempts came out of Macquarie Harbour during the penal station's life. The arithmetic on that will matter later. For Pearce, the decision came sooner. He had been sent to Macquarie Harbour after further offenses. He was under secondary punishment. Around him was water, and beyond the water was country the administration expected to discourage escape by its existence alone. The system was betting on geography. Pearce was willing to bet against it. If this story earned the next few minutes, a like helps more people find it. The water still had to be crossed, food still had to be found, distance still had to be covered. Getting off the island was only the first movement in an escape, not the end of one. Alexander Pearce had been sent there after further offenses in Van Diemen's Land. He would not stay. Alexander Pearce had been sent there after further offenses in Van Diemen's Land. He would not stay. On the 20th of September, 1822, Pearce and 7 other convicts escaped from Macquarie Harbour. 8 men left. The country beyond the harbour was the part of the security system that did not need a guard. It offered no road to Hobart, no chain of settlements, and no reliable source of food waiting for men who arrived on foot. The escapees carried provisions. After about 15 days, the provisions were gone. Then the calculation changed. Pearce later gave more than one account of what followed. Those accounts differ on some details, including the identity of the first man killed. Nobody wrote that down from the other side. 7 of the 8 men would not survive the escape. The part that can be stated without embroidery is enough. The starving men began killing members of their own party for food. Pearce participated. The group became smaller as the journey continued, until Pearce was the only one left alive. The language does not need help. This was not cannibalism inside Sarah Island. It happened after the men escaped. In the wilderness, the penal station relied on as a barrier. That distinction matters because the title of this story can otherwise reverse the geography. Sarah Island did not feed prisoners to one another. It helped create an escape in which getting away from the prison did not mean getting away from danger. Pearce eventually reached settled country. Then he was caught. He had been at large for 113 days, with roughly half that time spent in the wilderness. Back in custody, he told the magistrate and clergyman Robert Knopwood what had happened. Knopwood did not believe him. Not quite. The missing men were assumed to be alive somewhere in the colony, perhaps living as bushrangers. Pearce's account sounded less plausible than the idea that he was protecting fellow escapees. So he was returned to Macquarie Harbour. That is not a figure of speech. A man escaped a punishment station, crossed the country the station used as a wall, returned with a confession of killing and cannibalism, and was sent back because the confession sounded impossible. Then the story repeated itself. In November 1823, Pearce escaped again. This time, he went with Thomas Cox. The second escape lasted less than 10 days. Then Cox was killed. When Pearce was captured, parts of Cox's body were found in his pockets. Not quite the same problem as the first confession. By then, there was no need for the authorities to imagine missing bushrangers somewhere in the colony. Pearce was tried for Cox's murder, which is to say, cannibalism was not the charge. Murder was. Here's the part that closes Pearce's thread. He was found guilty on the 21st of June, 1824. On the 19th of July, Alexander Pearce was hanged at Hobart Town Jail. He had entered the transportation system on a 7-year sentence for stealing 6 pairs of shoes. He died under a sentence for murder. That distance matters. Pearce became the name attached to Sarah Island because his story was the one difficult to forget. But a famous prisoner can make a prison look simpler than it was. Pearce was one man. More than 180 escape attempts came out of Macquarie Harbour. Here's the part that changes the scale. The better question is not why Pearce ran. It is why so many men looked at the water, looked at the country beyond it, and still decided that leaving was worth the attempt. Pearce was the story that survived. The pattern was larger. Pearce was one man. More than 180 escape attempts came out of Macquarie Harbour. More than 180 attempts makes the word secure harder to use casually. If the landscape had been enough by itself, men would have stopped testing it. They did not. Absconding was particularly common in the early years, and each attempt forced the same calculation onto the settlement. Guards could control the island, but they could not remove the ID of the shore. On paper, the water was part of the security system. In practice, it was also the first problem an escapee had to solve. After that came the country. The administration had not been wrong about the West Coast. The terrain could defeat men without a wall, and Pearce's first escape is the clearest example. But a security system can be effective and still fail repeatedly. Sarah Island did not need every man to escape for the design to have a problem. It only needed men to keep trying. The arithmetic on that is worth doing slowly. The station and its outlying posts held up to about 385 male convicts at one time. More than 180 escape attempts were made across the life of the settlement. Not half the prisoners. The population changed, and some men could attempt more than once. They mean something simpler. Escape was not a marginal thought. The same institution that depended on isolation also depended on work. By the late 1820s, punishment methods had shifted, the labor system had settled into routine, and Sarah Island had become a productive shipbuilding center. The shipyard eventually produced more than 100 vessels. That fact deserves to sit next to the escape number. A punishment station surrounded by water became, for a time, the largest shipbuilding yard in the Australian colonies. Skilled convicts worked as shipwrights, carpenters, blacksmiths, and clerks. Lower status gangs did harder labor in the lumber yards, though Island used men differently because it needed different things from them. Here's the part that can get lost if Sarah Island is told only through punishment. Some prisoners left objects behind that had nothing to do with an escape. William Buelow Gould arrived in Van Diemen's Land as a transported convict in 1827. While under sentence at Macquarie Harbour, he was instructed to paint botanical and fish species. In 1832, on Sarah Island, he produced a sketchbook containing 36 watercolor paintings of fish. 36. The work survived. Nearly 2 centuries later, that sketchbook sits on the Australian Memory of the World Register. A man held inside a punishment station was ordered to observe fish closely enough to paint them, while other men on the same island were cutting timber, working iron, building vessels, serving punishments, and looking across the water. Sarah Island contained all of those things at once. That is why the cannibal story can distort the place if it is allowed to stand alone. Pearce shows what could happen after men ran into the country. Gould shows what the institution could extract from skill while men remained inside it. The shipyard shows something else. Sarah Island did not only take labor from prisoners, it sorted and used what they knew. Somebody had to know how a hull fitted together. Somebody had to know how timber was shaped, how ironwork held, how a vessel was launched, how damage was repaired, and what had to be aboard before a ship could leave a yard and stay afloat. Prisoners were part of that knowledge, and that was the point. The colony wanted the work without the freedom that normally followed from possessing the skill. For most of Sarah Island's life, the arrangement held. Ships were built, timber moved, men were punished, escapees were pursued, the harbor remained where it had always been. Then the wider penal system changed. Port Arthur opened in 1830 on the Tasman Peninsula. Sarah Island's role began to be phased out. The older station had been difficult to supply, difficult to manage, and was no longer the only place available for secondary punishment. The words used around closure became administrative. The consequences were physical. Men were moved. Functions shifted. The settlement that had been built in a rush in 1822 was being wound down little more than a decade later. But the shipyard was still there. So were men who knew how it worked. By 1833, the prison that had begun with Cuthbertson's founding party was approaching the end of its main life. The buildings remained. The harbor remained. The workshops remained long enough for one final vessel to be built. That vessel matters. Not because it was the largest ship made there, not because it was the most valuable, because of who eventually took it. If there is a colony you think belongs on this channel, the comments are red. Sarah Island was approaching its end. The shipyard was still working. As Sarah Island was approaching its end, the shipyard was still working. Port Arthur had opened in 1830 on the Tasman Peninsula, and Macquarie Harbour was being phased out as the colony's principal place of secondary punishment. By late 1833, the main Sarah Island penal station had closed. 11 years. 11. That was enough time to clear much of an 8-hectare island, build barracks and workshops, run a timber industry, punish generations of prisoners, and turn a remote penal station into a major colonial shipyard. By then, the island had already outlived the reason it had first been chosen. The government no longer depended on Macquarie Harbour alone for secondary punishment. Men were being moved elsewhere. Work contracted. A place assembled quickly in 1822 was being taken apart administratively in 1833. The harbor did not care. Boats still had to cross it. Timber still moved through it. The slips and workshops were still where they had been. Closing a penal station was not the same thing as erasing its skills overnight. Then came January 1834. The final vessel built at Sarah Island was the brig Frederick. 10 convicts took it. One of them was James Porter. He had already attempted escape several times before being sent to Macquarie Harbour. He also had experience at sea, that mattered now. The men did not run into the forest. They used the thing Sarah Island had spent years teaching prisoners to make: a ship. Here's the part that gives the whole story its second shape. At the beginning of the settlement, water had been part of the wall. The prison solved an economic problem by putting skilled convicts into a shipyard. At the end, 10 convicts took the final vessel built there and turned the wall into a road. No wilderness crossing, no march toward Hobart. The Frederick went to sea. That difference is larger than it first appears. Pearce's escape depended on legs, food, weather, and the hope that the country could be crossed before the country finished the men trying. The Frederick escape began with a working vessel. The prison had supplied the technology, not quite by choice. A shipyard only works when knowledge moves through it. Timber has to be selected and shaped. Ironwork has to fit. A hull has to be made watertight. Rigging, stores, steering, and repair all have to make sense to somebody. Some of those people were prisoners. On paper, the skill belonged to the yard. In practice, it stayed in the men. The 10 convicts seized the Frederick and sailed across the Pacific to Chile. They reached Valdivia, where they presented themselves as shipwrecked sailors and began living under new identities. For a time, it worked. That sentence deserves a second. Sarah Island had produced more than 100 vessels. The last one became the vehicle for its most audacious escape. And that was the point. The administration could control the assignment of labor. It could decide who worked as a shipwright, a carpenter, a blacksmith, or a clerk. It could control the yard while the station was functioning. It could not make knowledge forget itself. Not quite. The Frederick carried that contradiction out through Macquarie Harbour. By then, the men were in another country. Local authorities did not immediately send them back. Their position changed only after a change of governor in Chile. Then the group divided again. 6 escaped. 4 were imprisoned. Here is the part that brought 4 of them back to Tasmania. They were eventually returned to Hobart for trial. The possibility of hanging followed them home. They were spared on a legal technicality, which is to say, the voyage succeeded even though freedom did not last for all 10. The surviving official summary does not explain the technicality in enough detail to turn it into a courtroom scene. Nobody wrote down a version complete enough for that. The safe fact is narrower. 4 men came back to Hobart, faced trial, and did not go to the gallows for taking the Frederick. James Porter's story continued beyond Sarah Island. He was sentenced to death for piracy, but that sentence was commuted. He was sent to Norfolk Island instead. The institution had closed. Its consequences were still moving men around the empire. Which is to say, closure did not produce a clean ending. It produced paperwork, transfers, abandoned buildings, and stories that kept running after the station itself had stopped. The Frederick is one of them. By then, the contrast with Pearce was complete. Pearce had crossed the water and entered the wilderness. Food disappeared. 7 companions died. His confession was not believed. Porter and the men of the Frederick crossed the water in a vessel built at the station. They reached Chile. Same harbor, different technology. That does not prove the shipyard caused the escape. It proves something narrower and more useful. The institution could exploit prisoner skill without ever fully separating that skill from the men who possessed it. The prison needed shipwrights. Then shipwright knowledge became part of an escape. The prison needed boats. Then the last boat left with prisoners aboard. Dry symmetry can be misleading when history is forced into it. Here, the symmetry is in the sequence itself. The island began as a place where water made escape harder. It ended with water carrying 10 men away. In Sarah Island's system had always depended on a contradiction. The place was secure because it was remote, but useful because it was connected by water. The prisoners were dangerous enough to require isolation, but useful enough to be given trades. The wilderness could stop a man on foot. A ship changed the equation. By late 1833, the penal station was gone. In January 1834, the Frederick left Macquarie Harbour. The buildings remained, so did the marks of the work done there. The prison closed. The island did not disappear. The prison closed. The island did not disappear. For decades, Sarah Island kept being used for work that had little to do with imprisonment. Piners returned during the 19th century, and again in the 20th, using the island as a base while Huon pine was taken from the surrounding country. By then, the penal station was becoming a ruin in stages. The old buildings did not survive intact. During mining rushes on Tasmania's west coast, parts of the site were looted. Bricks and other building material were removed. That sounds ordinary. It was also how a prison became archaeology. A wall disappears one brick at a time. A workshop loses its roof. A slipway remains after the vessel that used it is gone. Names survive in maps longer than timber survives in weather. Sarah Island had been built quickly. It came apart slowly. Then the meaning of the island changed again. By the end of the 19th century, visitors were already coming to see the ruins and the landscape. In 1926, Sarah Island was reserved for tourism. It became a scenic reserve in 1954 and a historic site in 1970. In 1989, the island was included in the expanded Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. By then, nobody was arriving under sentence. The same water still controlled access, but the purpose had reversed. Boats now brought people who had chosen to come. Today, visitors travel from Strawn. A walking track runs through the remains of the settlement. The places identified on the island include the new penitentiary, the Commandant's Slipway, the bakehouse, and the tannery. Those are modest ruins for a story this large. That is useful. Sarah Island does not leave a visitor with one enormous prison block that explains itself from a distance. The site has to be reconstructed in pieces. A slipway here, a building foundation there, a line on a map where a workshop once stood. In practice, the absence does part of the work. The ship story survived too. In Strawn, the Frederick escape became the subject of a play called The Ship That Never Was. It opened in 1994 and became a long-running part of the town's telling of Sarah Island. The title works because the island has always had two afterlives. One is legend. Alexander Pearce supplies most of it. A convict escaped. Men starved, men killed. Pearce survived. The authorities did not believe him. That story is short enough to repeat. The other afterlife is harder to compress. It begins with an island of about 20 acres. It includes a founding party of convicts, soldiers, wives, children, officers, and a commandant trying to make an isolated outpost function. It includes an island with no meaningful source of fresh water becoming a settlement, a timber station, and a shipyard. It includes more than 100 vessels. It includes more than 180 escape attempts. It includes William Buelow Gould painting 36 fish in 1832 while he was still a prisoner. Then it includes 10 convicts taking the last ship out. That version is not cleaner. It is better. Here's the part that the title can hide if the title is allowed to do all the work. The cannibalism was real. It happened after an escape, in the wilderness beyond Macquarie Harbour. It was not the daily operating principle of Sarah Island. Pearce matters because he shows what the landscape could do after the first barrier had been crossed. The Frederick matters for the opposite reason. It shows what happened when prisoners stopped treating the water as a barrier at all. The two escapes turned the geography inside out. For Pearce, land became the danger. For Porter, water became the route. Between them sits the prison itself, using both. On paper, Sarah Island was selected for banishment and security. In practice, it became a labor station, a timber operation, a shipyard, and a place men tried repeatedly to leave. That is a larger story than the one word attached to Pearce, cannibal. The word is accurate as far as it goes. It does not go very far. By then, Sarah Island had become something else in public memory. The ruins were protected. The island entered a World Heritage. Landscape. Boats arrived with guides instead of guards. The practical difference is simple. Visitors can leave. That last fact changes the meaning of almost every view across the harbor. For the men sent there in 1822, a boat was controlled by somebody else. The water was part of the sentence. The country beyond it was expected to finish the argument. Pearce tested that argument on foot. Porter and 9 others tested it in a brig. Sarah Island lasted from 1822 until late 1833 as a penal station. Its most famous late escape came just after that closure in the final vessel the station built, which is to say, the last working object of the prison carried prisoners away from it. There is no need to improve the symmetry. Stand the pieces next to each other and the story's already there. 8 hectares, more than 100 vessels, more than 180 escape attempts, a convict who returned with a confession nobody believed, a final ship taken to Chile. The island was chosen because isolation was supposed to make running irrational. Men kept running anyway. Some were caught quickly, some died in the country. Pearce came back with a story that became the island's legend. Porter reached another continent in a vessel built by prisoner labor. The institution did not produce one kind of prisoner or one kind of escape. It produced a system. And systems leave more behind than legends. They leave foundations, workplaces, punishment rules, names in court reports, paintings made under sentence, ships built by men who were not free to choose where they lived. They also leave the language used to justify the place: banishment and security. The words are still useful because the island eventually tested both of them. Banishment worked. Security was more complicated. The water is still there. The distance is still there. The country beyond Macquarie Harbour is still large enough that the 8-hectare prison can look small against it. Visitors can walk past foundations and slips where buildings and vessels once stood. Then they can leave again by boat. The water was a wall until it was not. We go inside the places empires built beyond their own borders, one island at a time. And the empires built a great many of them.